In this lecture, we're going to talk about metabolic uncoupling. And metabolic uncoupling is really the key thing that life does, okay, that enables it to adapt and to evolve. And this is a little bit hard for chemists and biochemists to understand because if you're looking at an individual reaction, everything is coupled. Okay, you can account for the movement of all the atoms and all the electrons and all the phosphates and that kind of thing. And you can look at that reaction in terms of the free energy, the Gibbs free energy of reaction, and see whether it's exergonic or endogonic. And all reactions, in order to proceed, must be exergonic. There must be a negative delta G of reaction. If it's endergonic, there has to be something else coupled to the reaction to make it occur. All right, so let's take a look at this. And the first thing we want to talk about is there are two critical components involved. The first is electrons. That may seem a little odd to some people, but high energy electrons carry energy with them. Now, they don't exist as free electrons. Those are coupled with things like the nicotine adenine dinucleotide or the flavin dinucleotides or ferredoxin. Okay, they're large, highly conjugated aromatic organic molecules, and or they have iron associated with them, as in ferredoxin, but they're able to hold stably a free electron. And therefore, they have an oxidized form, which is absent the electron, and a reduced form. And we think of NAD being converted to NADPH. No charge, electroneutrality constraints say that no charge can exist without a countercharge, a local countercharge. So if NAD is net positively charged, then NADH has to have an associated proton because you've added an electron to it, which means there has to be an associated proton somewhere in the system. All right, so let's look at the oldest living things, or at least what we believe is related to the oldest living organisms. And here we believe life started at the ocean vents, the deep sea ocean vents. These were geothermal vents. They produced CO2, hydrogen, simple organic kinds of, or inorganic kinds of molecules, H2S. They spew out, this gravity plays a role here, the heat and pressure in the mantle or in the earth causes a process called diagenesis, and diagenesis spews out this organic matter, this simple organic matter and hydrogen, which provide energy to life. And this is where we think life evolved. The what we see today are the Iraqi bacteria, the ancient bacteria, are acetogens and methanogens. Those are we think these are the most closely related to the earliest living cells. Now let's look at the biochemistry that these cells conduct. Okay, if we take a careful look at acetogens, they bring in hydrogen, they bring in CO2, and they form their own organic matter, in this case formate. So CO2 is considered mineralized carbon, H2 is inorganic, it's hydrogen, but when we combine those two together, we form formate. Now, there's a phosphorylation event that occurs, so we consume an ATP in order to activate that formate, and we produce a formic THF derivative. We don't need to go into all the biochemistry here, but then there are two steps where we add electrons to that. So we're reducing that intermediate progressively. Okay, and then we transfer it to a sulfur-containing molecule that goes to acetyl-CoA, and then we can get that original ATP that we consumed, we get that back to form acetate. So that's the lowest level organic compound other than formate. That's the next lowest level organic compound, and that gets excreted by the cell. Now, if we're to ignore everything that's happening here at the membrane, this simple process ends up generating oxidized form of NAD, two oxidized forms of NAD, consuming two higher energy electrons in the process, and there's no net production of ATP. So the cell couldn't live on this. It wasn't generating anything that would allow it to build more of itself. As a matter of fact, it's consuming. There's a net consumption of electrons there. Okay, and if we now include what's happening at the membrane, all right, what we see is, particularly here, that we can convert through a series of processes, we can convert the oxidized form of NAD back to reduced NAD at the same time that we're pumping two sodium ions across the membrane. Now, it goes across the membrane into the environment, but it's really going across into the periplasmic space. So those two sodium ions build up in the periplasmic space. Some of them are lost to the environment. They'll diffuse through the outer membrane and they're lost. But a lot of them come back through the membrane, and they come back and allow the cell to generate ATP from ADP. So this is how we get the ATP that we need for the cell. It's the only way the cell can produce that ATP. So it's essentially using some of the hydrogen that comes in to regenerate the reducing equivalents it needs to do its metabolism, as well as through this ferredoxin couple produce a chemical gradient or a chemical potential, which has a delta G associated with it, a Gibbs free energy associated with it, that allows the cell to produce the net ATP it needs to grow. Now, energetically, this is not a overall terribly exergonic reaction. There's a very low delta G over the whole cell, but it's enough for the cell to survive. Now, the same thing happens in methanogens. You can go through the biochemistry of methanogens, but it's this uncoupling of the redox potential and ATP formation that again allows it to survive. Without that, there would be no mechanism by which it could continue to process things. In other words, it couldn't keep regenerating the reduced ferredoxin that it needs, or the reducing molecule that it needs in order to operate the biochemistry, if it was not producing this proton motive force. Okay, so if we look at this, we see these are the reactions that involve the reducing equivalent in some way, either consuming it or producing it. And the general biochemical intermediates are things like flavin-adenine dinucleotide, nicotine-adenine dinucleotide, and ferredoxin. Those are the most common. There's some others like the plastiquinones that are used in photosynthesis. But it's having those molecules that allow the reducing equivalent to be uncoupled from the biochemistry. We can take it from one reaction and we can transport it to another reaction that's occurring. Without that metabolic uncoupling, so that those two reactions don't have to occur together with the same enzyme, that's what allows the cell to adapt. So if we lose we'll see it in a minute. I won't talk about it quite yet. Now, there's another set of reactions here that involved ATP. So they're either consuming ATP or they're gaining ATP. And the key, though, are these reactions that occur at the membrane, where reducing equivalents are consumed to produce a chemical potential across the membrane. And remember, it's that membrane that separates the lower entropy of the associated with the cell or the living system, the more organized state, from the environment, which is the less organized state. Okay, so we can produce a proton, and we can produce a sodium gradient, or at least in these earliest Arachibacteria, we can produce a sodium ion gradient. Very quickly in other organisms, this has been displaced with a proton gradient. So you've heard of the proton motive force. We spend a lot of time in one of the chapters in the book talking about the proton motive force, but it's not limited to protons. In fact, in Arachibacteria, sodium is substituted for protons. So the earliest forms of life used a sodium ion gradient to generate a chemical potential. And you don't even need an ion to generate a chemical potential. Any gradient in chemical composition can produce a chemical potential. And these chemical potentials drive a lot of what's happening in the cell. One of the things they allow the cell to do is to drive evolution. Okay. Now, the proton gradients are generated from the reducing equivalents. In general, they're generated from the reducing equivalents, and they're then consumed, or they allow the production of ATP when the sodium is returned back to the cell. So there's a driving force for that reaction. We talk about how that works in the proton motive force. When protons are used, we call it oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, here it's a sodium ion that's doing exactly the same thing. Now remember, these are the earliest known forms of life, the Arachibacteria. This gets a lot more complicated when we go to more recent forms of life. All right. Now, one can argue that it was the membrane-bound enzymes that allowed the generation of a proton or a ion gradient across the membrane, or a chemical potential across the membrane, that was probably associated with the earliest living system. That it was not the biochemistry going on. Okay, the biochemistry may have followed what was happening, because you can imagine at the ocean vents there was a lot of pH gradients. The pH inside the cell could have been different than the pH outside the cell, or the sodium content inside the cell may have been different from the sodium content outside the cell. So initially, life could have existed just based on these chemical potentials across the cell membrane. And then it could have added a lot of other biochemistry along the way, and as a way to consume to either generate new reducing equivalents or consume the reducing equivalents and do something with the ATP, okay, or the nucleotide phosphates. It's not limited to ATP. So this is a very powerful tool, and what it really means is we can interrupt the biochemistry and we can replace different pieces of biochemistry and still be able to maintain life, as long as we are generating reducing equivalents, doing oxidation reactions within the cell on whatever we're consuming, and we can use those, we can effectively bring that energy back into the cell through oxidative phosphorylation. Now, all of these in principle are reversible. So if we had an excess of ATP, we could use that to drive sodium ions or protons across the membrane in a reverse of oxidative phosphorylation, and that could allow us to produce reducing equivalents. Okay, so that being able to uncouple specific biochemical steps from the overall production of energy equivalents is really critical to life. All right, so now let's look at this a little more deeply. Most biochemists or chemists think of individual reactions. Okay, and here's a classic one, which is the interchange between 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde and 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So this is a key step in both photosynthetic organisms between in the Calvin cycle of photosynthetic organisms, and it's a critical step in entering the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle in aerobic organisms. So it's present in both sets of organisms. It's going it's an equilibrium reaction, but it involves both phosphate and reduction, okay, or oxidation reduction. So both of these are involved in this step. So we have, if we understand the biochemistry now, we have so many molecules of 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, a number of molecules of NAD in the oxidized form, okay, and a phosphate. Combining those together, we can add the phosphate onto the glyceraldehyde to produce the bisphosphoglycerate. We end up with a reducing equivalent because we've transferred an electron now to this intermediate, this NADH intermediate, and we've produced an extra proton because once we steal the electron, it's coming from a hydrogen atom, so that atom now has a net positive charge and becomes a proton. All right, now I haven't written in what the stoichiometry is here. If you inspect this reaction, you can pretty quickly tell that it's going to be a 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. Okay, so it's kind of a trivial example. But in this one reaction, if you lost any of those components, this reaction could not occur. You have to have NAD positive, you have to have phosphate as an inorganic ion. Okay, you have to transfer the electron to produce NADH and an associated proton. Okay, that has to occur. This reaction is reversible. So we can consume excess NADH, reverse the process to produce inorganic phosphoric acid and the oxidized form of NAD, along with 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde. So this reaction is effectively reversible. It is a way to interchange, to make a high energy phosphate in a excess of NAD, or to consume NADH, or consume the reducing equivalents to produce more NAD if needed. All right, but you're sacrificing a high energy phosphate to do that. Now, there's only one possible stoichiometry here in order to make this equation balance. The classic way of doing this is to do an elemental balance, and we can do a balance on the carbon, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, the oxygen, and the phosphate. We can't create or destroy any of those atoms within biochemistry. Yes, we can create or destroy them if we go into nuclear reactions, and we could throw protons at it, throw high energy neutrons at it, break up the molecules and produce break up the atoms and produce different atoms. But there's none of that is occurring, outside of science fiction. None of that occurs within biochemistry. So an atom has to remain as an atom. This allows us to write a series of balance equations. Now, since there's an electron transfer here, we also have to, we're not creating or destroying electrons either. Okay, sometimes people will do this by a charge balance. I prefer to do this by an electron balance. So I know how many electrons are associated with each element. Okay, and I can account for those, and I do that here. Okay, I can account for those. There's a certain number of electrons associated with it. If that atom is charged, okay, then if it's positively charged, it has to have lost an electron. If it's negatively charged, like oxygen, okay, or sulfur, it's doubly negatively charged, it has to have gained 2 electrons. Okay, so a hydrogen atom has no electrons, has all of its electrons stripped off of it. An oxygen atom has 2 electrons added to it if it is doubly negatively charged. Okay, an iron iron ion. You can have both ferric and ferrous and ferric. Okay, and because this is a 2 plus, it has to have lost 2 electrons. If this is a 3 plus, it has to have lost 3 electrons from its neutral state. So I can easily do an electron balance around all these atoms. Okay, and you can do this for any atom on the periodic table. It's fairly easy to do because the number of electrons has to be equal to the number of protons for the neutral state, and now you just need to know the charge state on the atom to calculate the residual electrons. Okay, so I can add to the elemental balances, I can add an electron balance because we're not creating or destroying electrons, we're just moving them from molecule to molecule. All right, if I do this, if I add it to this trivial single example, okay, I can add the electron balance into the elemental balances, and then I'm allowed a basis. I'm allowed to specify one of the stoichiometric values. Typically, you just set 1 to 1, and you see what the others fall out to be. But now I have 7 equations and 6 unknowns, which means one of the balance equations is redundant. So for this example of phosphoglyceraldehyde example, okay, I do not need to look at the electron balance in order to get the reaction stoichiometry. This is a very trivial single reaction stoichiometry. There's one and only one unique solution. If I solve that and my electron balance is out of whack, I did something wrong. Okay, so I can use this to solve for what the stoichiometry is. This is a classic technique. You can use this on pretty much any reaction that you want, but you can also use it when you start getting into metabolic networks. Now here we have a mixed acid fermentation metabolic network. There are lots of, if we're starting from 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, which is the same point we started at before, we go to 1,3-diphosphoglycerate, but now that has multiple paths that it may take. It doesn't just go on to one other reaction. It can go to phosphoenolpyruvate and on to oxaloacetate, and that can go on to malate, fumate, and succinate, the succinate being exported from the cell. Okay, malate, fumarate, and ethanol can also all be exported from the cell. Acetaldehyde is an intermediate. If I go from diphosphoglycerate, I can go down to pyruvate, and the pyruvate can produce acetyl-CoA or formate. All of these potentially can be exported from the cell. Okay, so now everything else, all these other intermediates, except for what I import from outside the cell, so I can import glucose, I can get all these metabolic wastes exported from the cell. So now I have multiple possible pathways. Okay, so I can write, and from the point of view of the environment, it looks like I've lost glucose, I've lost CO2, and I've lost water. I don't know the proportions. Okay, so I write A times glucose, B times CO2, C times water. But I'm producing a whole bunch of, along with ethanol and acetaldehyde, I'm producing a whole bunch of other materials. Now, if the cell is not growing, which very often you run these mixed acid fermentations in a case where it's growing only very slowly, if it's growing at all, okay? So I could set this up so, say, phosphate was limiting, okay? And now it'll just keep doing this metabolism, converting sugar into these mixed acids and ethanol, but it can't grow because it has no phosphate or it has no nitrogen. That's that mild starvation condition. So if the cells are in a stationary phase, I'm still getting these metabolites produced. So from the point of view of the environment sees I'm losing these things, those are my reactants, there's a black box occurring, and then I get these things back. So all of these potential things that are exported from the cell become possible products of the reaction. The environment doesn't care what's happening inside the cell, it only cares what it sees. That's the beauty of this analysis. All right, there's one other thing that can occur, of course, and that's oxidative phosphorylation, where the excess reducing equivalents in the form of NADH pump protons outside the cell, and those protons can come back in through the cell. Now, this actually is uncoupled. There are two separate enzymes involved in this. Okay, I've just showed it as one unit here, but I can reoxidize the NAD to pump two protons into the periplasm to create a proton motive force. That proton motive force can then be utilized to produce ATP from ADP inside the cell. Okay, consuming a hydroxide ion in the process because we have to neutralize the protons. All right, so all of this is going on. Now, let's look at the system of elemental balance equations in the electron balance. Well, we only have a few elements here. We have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. From the point of view of the environment, I only have those three elements. So I can write out those material balances, and suddenly I've got 14 unknowns. So I've only got three equations and 14 unknowns. Now, I know I have to account for all the electrons. Okay, and I can do that. I can write an electron balance. So that now gives me four equations, and I can add a basis. I can say, okay, I want the glucose to be 1. So with 1 glucose, what do I get? Okay. Now, I've got 5 equations and 14 unknowns. That means there's 9 degrees of freedom to the solution. What does that mean? Well, that means there's a whole bunch of possibilities that are equally valid. They will account for all the stoichiometries that need to occur. I can raise the amount of ethanol and lower the amount of formate or acetate. I can raise the acetate and lower the amount of ethanol. There's a lot of ways, and multiple other things like succinate. There's no single stoichiometry for this metabolic network. That there's multiples that satisfy the balance equations, where I don't have to create or destroy atoms or electrons. Now, that means it's not a complete solution. Okay. It also means I can add constraints onto the possible solutions. One of those constraints is that the ATP, if I know these cells need to survive, they need to replace cell components, they need to maintain their viability, or they need to reproduce, that the net ATP produced must be greater than or equal to 0. If it was equal to 0, then the cell would ultimately not be able to repair itself. So it's got to be greater than 0. If it's equal to 0, it may be able to sustain itself for a period of time by recycling internal nutrients, as we saw in the first lecture. Okay, but it can't really grow, and at some point it will start to die. The same is true of reducing equivalents. Okay, and you can put it as either NAD or NADH. It's probably better to put it as NADH. But I know I need to accumulate NADH. Okay, I need those high energy electrons so that I can reduce other compounds to grow, or to produce more ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. So those are two constraints I can put on the system. The third constraint is one that comes out of basic thermodynamics. The free energy of the reaction must be negative. Now, it's the free energy of the reaction from the point of view of the environment. Okay, if that overall reaction, or the net ratio of different products that are coming back to the environment, is not less than what went in, which is the glucose, the CO2, and the water. Okay, if that is not negative, if that free energy of reaction is not negative, the reaction will not proceed. That means the cell has to be providing extra resources, extra energy resources, to make this reaction occur. Well, it doesn't have those resources. It gains those resources from the free energy of the catabolic reaction that it's performing. So I can add 3 more equations to my system of equations to reduce the degrees of freedom from 9 to 6. But I still have 6 degrees of freedom, which means there's more than one possible solution. There's actually an infinite number of solutions that fall within the mass balance, the elemental balances, the electron balance, and these 3 constraining equations. And I could, in principle, map that out in a 6-dimensional space. I could say anything within this 6-dimensional sphere is feasible. I can get any of those stoichiometries, and maybe there's some over here that I could also get that would be metastable, where it could switch from one to another. Okay, I don't know what drives that shift, but it could happen. In general, though, there's probably going to be one sphere in 6 dimensions where the organism can happily survive. That is the key to adaptation. It means I can lose any one of those reactions and the organism will still survive. Matter of fact, I could lose up to 6 of those products and the organism will survive. Now that's interesting. That gives me degrees of freedom within which I can evolve. Sometimes I may have a suboptimal solution. It's not as good as the organism that I mutated from, in which case I will probably be outcompeted thermodynamically in the environment, and my newness will not survive. Sometimes it's a more optimal solution. And if it's a more optimal solution, I will outcompete my predecessor. Okay, and that is the true underlying nature of evolution. If I can get more from my environment than somebody else, I survive, he won't, because I will outcompete him. Now, it also means I can bring in new reactions and not have to worry about it. Okay, if the new reaction isn't favorable, I still do what I was doing before. So if I bring in a new feedstock, instead of glucose, I do some other sugar. No problem. As long as it can enter somewhere into the existing pathway, there's no problem. So this allows me to add to my repertoire of biochemistry. I can experiment. I can add new things. If they don't work out, no great loss. I can still do what I used to do. I may be outcompeted by my progeny that lacks that, okay, or my predecessor, my parent who lacks that, because there's an economic consequence to producing something new. Okay, I'm producing something that does nothing for me, so I'm consuming more resources, so to speak. Sometimes it allows me to survive in a suboptimal environment where my predecessor wasn't as good as I am. So this metabolic, the ability to uncouple the metabolism, is really the key to both adaptation and evolution. I can move around within my environment and adapt to new environments without much difficulty. I'm not locked into a single form of biochemistry because I may consume that from my environment and now I have to move on to something else. So this is really the key to one of the aspects of life, which is adaptation and evolution. If I didn't have this kind of broad metabolic network that was metabolically uncoupled through things like NAD and FAD and ferredoxin that can stably transport high energy electrons around, and ATP or nucleotide phosphates, if I didn't have those, I couldn't survive. I couldn't be called life because I would have no ability to adapt from the limited biochemistry that I can perform. All right. So there's a lot of thermodynamics behind all this. You'll see a whole chapter on the thermodynamics, both of the uh, chemical potential across the cell membrane, as well, and whether it's PMF, sodium ions, or just chemicals, they all provide uh, chemical potential. You can see how that is the thermodynamics of that. You can see how you calculate the thermodynamics of all these different reactions. There's a whole chapter on the thermodynamics in the textbook. You can also see how these gradients, these chemical potentials, are used to transport molecules across the membrane in another chapter of the textbook. So again, I encourage you to look at the textbook. We're not going to cover all those things. I wanted to emphasize how important the breaking down into substeps and having alternative substeps is to the ability of a cell to adapt and evolve. And that's what we discussed here. That's the end of this lecture. Thank you.